He carried his sleeping daughter up the marble walkway of a neighborhood he had built from bare dirt, and the woman guarding the door decided he didn't belong there before he said a single word. Stephen Hart wore a faded gray hoodie and jeans worn soft at the knees. 6-year-old Mia slept against his shoulder, her beaded braids resting on his neck, one small arm locked around a brown teddy bear. Tucked under his other arm was a plain manila folder, its corner frayed, the word deeds just visible through the flap. To anyone watching, he looked like a man who had wandered somewhere he couldn't afford to stand. Victoria Vance stepped into the doorway of the glass sales pavilion, sharp in a canary yellow blazer, and crossed her arms. She looked him over once, the hoodie, the boots, the child, and said it loud enough for the couple flipping through brochures behind her to catch every word. People like you don't live here. 90 seconds later, she was beaming, pressing a set of model home keys into the hands of that same couple, who hadn't even asked to tour it. And when Stephen quietly asked to speak with whoever ran the office, she snapped her fingers at a security guard and had him march toward the iron gate like a trespasser, in front of a gathering crowd of buyers who had no idea the man being escorted off the property owned every brick, every gate, and every paycheck signed inside that building. Before the day was over, someone was going to be cleaning out their desk. If you've ever been sized up in one glance and quietly told you didn't belong, pull up a chair, because this one is for you. Stephen Hart had learned to build things before he learned to trust the people who managed them. He'd grown up in a rented duplex where the landlord let the heat fail every January, and he'd spent his 20s working 2 jobs while sketching floor plans on the backs of receipts, convinced that somewhere out there was a version of the world where a man could be judged by what he made, rather than what he wore walking in the door. He built that world himself, one parcel at a time. Hart Luxury Development started as a single flipped bungalow and grew, over 15 relentless years, into a company that shaped whole townships out of raw earth. The trade magazines called him a visionary. The bankers called him first. But the thing Stephen was proudest of never made it into a headline, and it was sleeping against his shoulder most days now. Mia had come into his life 6 years ago and become its center of gravity almost immediately. When her mother passed, quietly, cruelly, in a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic and rain, Stephen had made a decision the way he made all his real decisions. Without ceremony and without announcing it to anyone. Mia would go where he went. Board meetings, site walks, red-eye flights to close deals in cities she couldn't yet spell. She grew up in the passenger seats of his trucks and the corners of his conference rooms, a little girl with beaded braids and a brown teddy bear who knew the names of half his foremen. People assumed a billionaire would hand his daughter to a nanny and a private school. Stephen had done neither. He'd buried her mother and promised, over the fresh dirt, that Mia would never once feel like the world had decided she didn't belong in it. Which was why, on that particular Saturday, he pointed his truck toward Crestwood Estates without telling a soul he was coming. Crestwood was the crown of everything he'd built. 300 acres of rolling streets and stone-fronted homes, a gated community set to open to the public in 2 weeks. It was also, quietly, the promise he'd made himself, made physical. A place designed so that any family, regardless of where they came from or what they could afford to wear on a weekend, would be met at the door with dignity. He had a habit he never discussed in interviews. Before any development launched, he walked it himself, unannounced and dressed down, because a company only ever shows you its real face when it believes no one important is watching. He'd been overlooked in enough marble lobbies to know the difference between what a business advertised and what it actually did when a man in a hoodie walked in. So he dressed for it. A faded gray hoodie, soft from years of washing. Jeans worn pale at the knees. Work boots that had actually seen work. Nothing about him that morning suggested he owned the license plate on the truck, let alone the land it was driving toward. Mia climbed into the back in a pink sweater, teddy bear tucked under one arm, and was asleep before they'd cleared the first highway on-ramp, the deep, boneless sleep of a child who feels entirely safe. Stephen glanced at her in the mirror every few miles, and drove the long way, in no hurry, letting the weekend stretch out ahead of them. When he pulled up to the site office, he reached across to the glove compartment and drew out the one thing that didn't match the rest of him, a plain manila folder, its corner frayed, holding the final signed master deed portfolio for the entire township. He'd meant to lock it in the site safe himself. He tucked it under his arm, lifted his sleeping daughter carefully against his shoulder, and started up the walkway. The sales pavilion sat at the heart of the development, a wall of glass catching the morning sun, fronted by a pristine strip of white marble that his own crews had laid the month before. Stephen walked it slowly, cataloging small things the way he always did. A light fixture set a half-inch crooked, a shrub that needed water. He was still 10 feet from the door when he was spotted. Victoria Vance saw him through the glass, and her expression changed before he'd taken another step. She was sharp in a canary-yellow blazer over a black skirt, blonde hair pinned with the kind of precision that suggested she considered appearance a moral quality. She looked at the hoodie. She looked at the boots. She looked at the child and the frayed folder, and something in her face closed like a shutter. By the time Stephen reached the threshold, she had already stepped out to block it, arms crossing tight over her chest, chin lifting, positioning her body squarely between him and the door, as though he were a draft she meant to keep out. "Can I help you?" she said. It wasn't a question. It was a wall. "Good morning." Stephen kept his voice easy, shifting Mia's weight gently against his shoulder. "I'd like to see the layout of the Phase 1 properties, if that's all right." Victoria let out a short breath through her nose, somewhere between a laugh and a scoff. "The model tours are by appointment," she said, "for qualified buyers only. We're very selective about who we bring through during the pre-launch." Her eyes did another slow circuit of him, and whatever conclusion she reached, she made no effort to hide it. Behind her, through the glass, a well-dressed couple had drifted up from the brochure table to watch, and Victoria's voice rose just enough to be sure they heard the next part. "Let me be clear, sir. People like you don't live here." She said it flatly, as if reciting a policy. "You're making the prospective clients uncomfortable. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Stephen didn't flinch. He had heard versions of that sentence in a dozen lobbies over the years, and he had learned to hold very still inside it, to let it finish so he could see exactly how far it went. He looked past her, into the pavilion, and let his gaze move over the space he had designed. The reception desk, the model of the neighborhood glowing under its display light, the framed corporate charter on the wall, bearing the company's anti-discrimination pledge in gold lettering, that Victoria apparently walked past every morning without reading. That was when he noticed the young woman near the glass doors. Elena couldn't have been more than a year out of school. She stood a few feet behind Victoria in a plain gray suit, a tablet clutched against her chest, and she was watching the whole exchange with a rising, visible dread. Stephen saw her glance down at the screen, then up at his face, then down again, and he saw the exact moment the color drained out of hers. She had the afternoon itinerary open. She had recognized the name, her mouth opened slightly. She took half a step forward, one hand lifting as if to touch Victoria's sleeve. "Victoria," she said, barely above a whisper. "I really think that name on the schedule." "Not now, Elena." Victoria didn't even turn her head. "Go make sure the Prescott file is ready." Elena froze, caught between the woman who signed her reviews and the certainty rising in her chest, and the intimidation won, the way it usually does with people who have the least power and the most to lose. She stepped back toward the desk, knuckles white around the tablet, sweat beading at her hairline, saying nothing more. Stephen watched all of it and said nothing either. He wasn't angry, not yet. Anger would have been a luxury that clouded what he needed to see. What he felt instead was a cold, clarifying attention, the same focus he brought to a set of blueprints when he was hunting for the flaw that would bring a whole structure down. This wasn't one rude woman, this was a hiring choice, a training failure, a culture that had grown up somewhere inside his own company, while he was busy pouring foundations. He stood on his own marble walkway, holding his own sleeping daughter, and he cataloged the rot with the patience of a man who intended to tear it out by the roots. He did not leave. That refusal, quiet, immovable, seemed to offend Victoria more than any argument could have. When Stephen simply remained on the sidewalk, unbothered, waiting, she turned toward the interior and lifted two fingers toward a figure standing near the far corner of the pavilion. Officer Sterling crossed the lobby in a crisp black security uniform, tall and broad through the shoulders, his boots landing with deliberate weight. He was the sort of man hired precisely because his presence ended conversations. He came through the glass doors and planted himself beside Victoria, thumbs hooking near his utility belt in that practiced posture meant to remind everyone present who held authority here. "Sir, this is private property," Sterling said, his voice pitched low and flat. "I need you to leave the premises immediately, or I'll have to escort you off. After that, we're looking at trespassing charges. Your choice." And it was that voice, firm, loud, edged with warning, that reached down into Mia's sleep and pulled her out of it. She stirred against Stephen's shoulder, lifted her head, and blinked at the ring of tense adult faces surrounding her father. Her small arms tightened around the teddy bear, drawing it up under her chin like a shield. She looked at the angry woman in yellow and the big man in black, and then up at her father, and her voice came out small and frightened and impossibly clear. "Daddy," she said, "why is that lady angry at us? Did we do something wrong?" Something moved behind Stephen's eyes, a flare of pure paternal fury, there and gone. But he did not raise his voice. He did not so much as tighten his grip. He turned his head and pressed a slow kiss to Mia's temple, murmuring, "No, baby, we didn't do anything wrong. Some grown-ups just forget their manners sometimes. Daddy's going to help them remember." And as he said it, soft, warm, meant only for his daughter, he lifted his gaze and held it directly on Victoria's face, and there was something in that calm that was far more unsettling than shouting could ever have been. Sterling, mistaking stillness for stubbornness, reached out to take Stephen's arm. "Don't." One word. Quiet. It landed like a dropped anchor, and Sterling's hand actually stopped in the air. Stephen shifted Mia gently to his hip, freeing his other arm, and with an unhurried motion opened the frayed manila folder tucked against his side. He drew out the top document and held it out, not to Victoria, but to the guard. "Read the name on the deed," he said. Sterling took it the way a man takes something he already suspects he doesn't want. It was the certified master land deed for all of Crestwood Estates. 300 acres, every street, every structure. The sales pavilion they were standing in front of, and the service contract for the very security firm whose uniform he was wearing. All of it listed under a single owner, Stephen Hart. 100%. The guard's eyes moved across the page once, then again, and the authority drained out of his posture line by line until his hands weren't quite steady. Stephen had already lifted his phone. He tapped a contact, put it on speaker, and let it ring into the silence. It was answered on the second ring, bright and immediate. "Mr. Hart, did you make it out to the development all right? Please tell me the staff's been taking good care of you. I know Crestwood's your favorite. Everything ready for the launch?" The voice of the company's chief operating officer carried clean across the marble, into the crowd of buyers who had gathered to watch, and into Victoria Vance, whose crossed arms slowly came undone. The color left her face in a single wave. Her lips parted around a word that never arrived. Stephen watched her do the arithmetic in real time. The hoodie, the folder, the child, the name on the schedule Elena had tried to warn her about, and reached the sum at last. She had spent the last 10 minutes trying to have the man who signed her commission checks arrested on the property he owned. "Everything's clear now," Stephen said into the phone, his eyes never leaving Victoria. "I've got what I needed." He handed the deed back to Sterling and finally addressed her directly, his tone even, almost gentle, which somehow made it land harder. "Ms. Vance, there's a pledge framed on the wall behind you. Anti-discrimination, dignity for every visitor. You walk past it every morning. Today you violated every line of it, in front of witnesses, to a family standing on a public walkway." He let that settle. "You're done here. Clean out your desk. HR will be in touch about the rest." She started to speak. A name, a protest, the beginning of some appeal, and Stephen simply shook his head once, and that was the end of it. He turned to Sterling, who had gone very quiet. "You didn't start this," Stephen told him, "but you were ready to put hands on a man and his child because someone in a blazer pointed. That instinct nearly cost you. You'll be enrolling in the county's de-escalation and community service program. Full course, on the company's time. Come back better, and there's still a place for you here." Then he looked toward the glass doors, where Elena stood frozen, certain she was next. "And you," he said, and his voice softened. "You saw it. You checked the name, you knew, and you tried to speak up even when the person above you told you to sit down. You were the only one here who did." He nodded slowly. "I've been looking for someone to run this branch who understands that how you treat people when you think it doesn't matter is the only time it ever really counts. Congratulations, Director." Elena's tablet nearly slipped from her hands. Months later, Stephen walked those same streets on an ordinary evening, Mia's hand tucked in his, her teddy bear dangling from her other fist. Crestwood was full now, porch lights coming on in windows, kids on bikes, neighbors who looked like every corner of the world calling greetings across trimmed lawns. A young couple waved from a driveway. An older man nodded from his garden. Nobody sized up the man in the hoodie walking hand in hand with his little girl. They just waved, because here, at last, everyone belonged. Mia looked up at him. "Daddy, is this the place you built?" "It is," he said. "For you. If this story reached something in you, do me a favor before you go. Hit subscribe so you don't miss where we head next, and leave a comment telling me the town or country you're watching from. I read every one, and there's nothing I love more than sending a personal hello and seeing just how far this little family's journey has traveled across the map. Let's find out together.